Welcome to Chapter 9, Group Processes, Influence in Social Groups for PSY 235, Social Psychology. In this video, I'll be covering Learning Objective 9.1, explain what groups are and why people join them. When psychologists talk about groups, it may not be exactly what you think a group is. Basically, psychologists operationalize the word group as two or more people, but they have to have some special characteristics. They do have to actually interact with each other. That doesn't necessarily mean in person physically. It could be on a phone. It could be through text messages. It could be online. It could be in a lot of different ways, but they have to interact and they have to have some sense of interdependence. In other words, they have to feel like their needs or goals that they have are actually group in nature. So there's motivation to influence each other. Since you need each other, there's a sense of dependency and connection. Now, groups are usually larger than two people, and often we refer in research to a group of only two people as a dyad. But groups can come in many different shapes and sizes. Anything two or higher is considered to be a group. There are lots of psychological reasons for why people want to join groups. In part, we are engineered as a species. We have evolved to need other people, not just to reproduce, but in fact to survive. So we tend to be social, and we tend to organize ourselves in groups of various kinds. Some of our groups are defined by our blood relations, but other groups are based on factors like common interests. So why do we join groups? Groups do allow us to do more things. So sometimes there are tasks that we simply can't do alone, or that would be much more difficult if we were trying to do them alone. So we collect people, we join groups of people in order to achieve those goals. Sometimes joining groups actually helps us meet really critical human needs. And there are lots of those needs. Needs like communion, being able to connect with others, to feel emotionally connected to others is an important need. We have important needs for empathy and fulfillment. And relationships that we have within our groups can actually help us with those things. It has been found that people, regardless of culture, are motivated to connect with other people. It's also been found that regardless of cultural context, we pay a lot of attention to where we stand in our various groups. We look at our status, we look at the interconnections we have with various group members, and humans tend to show a fair amount of concern about being rejected by their social groups as well. So there's this simultaneous push and pull, the need to feel distinctive, but at the same time to feel like you belong. And both of those things are basic human needs. We have a need for uniqueness, but at the same time, we have a need for belongingness and connection. Groups also perform identity functions. When we are asked to, if you meet someone new and they ask you to they say something like, "Tell me about yourself," which is a question I seriously hate trying to answer because I'm like, I don't know. Anyway, we often come up with, a list of things that are about our traits, but sometimes we also will identify ourselves in terms of groups to which we belong. That could be your profession is a group, although it's an ill-defined one. Your status as a fan of a particular sport or musical artist. You could also define yourself in terms of identity pieces like your race or ethnicity, your religion, the state where you live, the town where you live. There are lots of different ways that we use groups to fashion our identity. On a college campus, it could be clubs that you belong to, or more personally, your friend group helps define who you are as well. Now, groups have a lot of benefits. they have some drawbacks, but they also have a lot of benefits. As I was just saying, they do become an important part of our identity. I was in Ireland several years ago. I was teaching abroad, and one of my kids came with me, and we were in Galway in a pub having dinner, and yes, a few drinks because it was my kid's birthday. And I noticed somebody way across the bar in an Ohio State an Ohio State logo sweatshirt. And I just spontaneously, okay, there was gin involved, shouted OH. And immediately several people across the bar said IO, which is a very Ohio thing to do. And, the natives really just did not understand what we were talking about. But, we explained to a couple of the people around us, so your sports team, do you have some kind of tag phrase? And they were like, oh, yeah. And if you shouted that, if you were on a plane or in another country and you shouted that and there was some other Irish person, would they know it? And they said yes. So we use groupness to help identify ourselves, but also to other people. It's a weird way of connecting that we have in Ohio when you shout OH and people respond pretty immediately with IO. When we're connected to other people in groups, they help us to understand and navigate social norms. Oftentimes when students come to college, one of the first things that we try as a university to get them to do is to join groups. And part of why we do that is that the sense of belonging helps students to feel comfortable, helps them to feel safe and understood. But, the other side of it is that it helps people to understand how the environment of the university actually functions. It helps you to understand how social norms work in this new environment that you've found yourself in. So when you join a group that has had existing members, they can inform you either formally or informally as to what the norms are for successful behavior. Groups also help us get stuff done. So, as I said earlier, sometimes tasks are just too big and we can't solve them just by ourselves. We need to combine our efforts with other people so that we can accomplish those goals. Groups are built in a whole bunch of different ways and they perform different functions. Groups do vary in size. Typically, if we're talking about meaningful social groups like friend groups, they tend to have from 3 to 6 members. Now, there are other groups like being an Ohio State fan or being a Taylor Swift fan that have millions in them. Now, those are not the kinds of groups that most psychological research is focused on. We've mostly looked at groups that are functional, meaning that the people in the group have meaningful contact and interactions with each other, and they are involved in achieving various interdependent goals. Now, I belong to a group called Ohio State Fans, but do we get together and hang out and accomplish goals together other than cheering at a game? Not really. So when we're talking about groups as psychologists, we're typically focusing on those highly personal functional groups that have about 3 to 6 members. When groups get too big, it's not possible to interact with all the members. I'm sure you have memories of the COVID years when you were taking online classes via Zoom or Teams or whatever, and there were all those little boxes with people's faces in them. Once you get beyond about, 3 to 6, it's impossible to even look at everyone's faces and see them as individuals. So when groups get too big, it does become very difficult to interact with all the members. Universities, you can look at the university as something that feeds your identity, like the fandom that is Ohio State or Mount Union. It's not going to function as a group the way psychologists are defining the word group, because you're not going to have those kind of interdependent goals with every other student who belongs in that fandom. So we do in psychology really emphasize functional groups where you have interdependence and goals and can have meaningful interactions with the other members of the group. And there are lots of factors that can impact how we behave in groups and how they function. So we need to really explore some of the ways that happens. The primary way in which groups function is through having roles and norms. Some of those are explicit and some of them are implicit. Explicit meaning they're written down, like there's a policy book or a set of bylaws or a constitution for a club that you belong to. Those are explicit, and it will outline all of the roles and responsibilities of various people within the group, and will sometimes outline normative expectations. In a lot of groups, though, they're sufficiently informal that they're just not written down, and you have to learn through interacting with the group what those norms and roles are. So social norms, just to clarify the difference between norms and roles, social norms specify how all group members are expected to act. So norms specify behaviors and behavioral expectations. Social roles, on the other hand, are expectations about how specific people are supposed to act within the group. So let's say that you're in a formal club and you have a constitution and you have officers. Those officers have role descriptions and their expectations for how those individuals are to behave. Or in a family, we have lots of traditional social expectations about how a family is supposed to function and who's supposed to perform what roles. Even in quote-unquote non-traditional families, families tend to create roles for people to play in them. Like in my family, I love doing yard work, so I tend to be responsible for the yard and the gardens and all of that stuff. And I tend to be the one who tells people when the lawn needs to be mowed and when various tasks need to be done. My husband has tended to be responsible for some of the financial stuff, like taxes. That's his role. So sometimes roles are very formal and very explicit. Sometimes they're a little more informal and formative, meaning they're going to be defined based on the talents and abilities and preferences of the people involved. Social roles are really going to specify how people occupying certain positions should behave, but also it's going to determine what kind of consequences there might be if people don't behave that way. So people can, in fact, become consumed by the roles that they play. And that's in terms of both the normative expectations. Sometimes people get really into the norms and they start to police everybody else's behavior, but also the roles can become so all-consuming that people will forget that the role is basically something that's been created for specific purposes, and they may adopt the role as their identity, and that can sometimes be problematic. Another characteristic of groups is something called group cohesiveness. Group cohesion is defined in terms of the ways in which groups can create norms and expectations that bind the group members together, and also that facilitate liking. Lots of the clubs and groups, organizations that you've belonged to probably have aspects of this. You've probably been a member of a very, very cohesive group. Like when I was in high school, the sprinters on the track team, especially the first 3 years that I was in high school, were a very tight-knit group. We did a lot of things together. We had a lot of things in common. We had very intentionally, were very communicative I mean, this was long before cell phones, but we talked all the time. We talked about personal things. We talked about ridiculous things. We were highly, highly cohesive group. You've probably also been a member of a group that was very divisive, where there were factions within the group. There was a lot of conflict and a lot of argument. Those are the two polar opposite ends of group cohesiveness. Sometimes you have groups that are tightly cohesive and very like-minded. Sometimes you have groups that are very divided and have lots of divisions and subgroups that make them up. Typically, the more cohesive a group is, the more likely people are to stay in the group, because we tend to find comfort in cohesion. You're also more likely to take part in activities that are prescribed by the group. Even if you personally would never engage in those activities, you're more likely to do them. And you're more likely to be invested in bringing new like-minded people into the fold. Now, you can probably see that cohesion is likely to be a double-edged sword. Cohesion can create really wonderfully tight-knit, mutually rewarding groups. At the same time, that cohesion can sometimes put people in a position where they'll make bad decisions. So we'll talk about that. We'll bring that back up in a little bit. What are some of the factors that are related to group cohesiveness? Because cohesiveness just doesn't come out of nowhere. It really has to be facilitated. If you have a group that has come together for primarily social reasons, like to do an activity or because they like the same thing, like I'm thinking of how one of my kids is definitely a digital native, and is also a gamer. And from a very early age, they were online finding friends who liked the exact same kinds of video games and played them in the same way. So if a group forms for those kinds of social reasons, they tend to be more cohesive. And in fact, for my kiddo, who's now in their 20s, they made friends playing Minecraft when they were in middle school that they still have today. And they still have Minecraft servers in common. So, they got together for social reasons, and the shared interest was one of the things that glued them together, and that has made them a very cohesive group. If the function of the group is to actually solve problems, though, then things are a little more complicated. Sometimes group cohesion can facilitate group problem solving. Like in the gaming example, if you have a tight-knit group that plays a specific game really well, cohesion is a part of the problem solving of gaming. If, however, you're in a different kind of group where you really have to work together to solve problems, there are times when cohesion can make the group less smart than the individual members. If tasks require really, really, really tight cooperation, cohesiveness is better. So going back to the gaming example, my kid plays some multiplayer games, and in that case, like there's this one game where they play with 3 other people against 4 other people that they don't know. And in the particular game that they were playing, it requires a great deal of cooperation and following tactical plans. And in that case, knowing each other really well and being really cohesive is extremely helpful. If, however, if you want to maintain really tight relationships among the group members, but that becomes more important than finding good solutions to problems, that's when cohesiveness can be a problem. So, if you're facing a really difficult challenge as a group, but you don't want anything to rock the boat, if there's an issue within the group, but you don't want to mess things up in terms of the relationships, you may not raise concerns that you have. So if the norm in the group is preserve the relationships in the group at all costs, then you may actually find yourself getting into deeper and deeper trouble because you're not solving problems by raising concerns early enough. Now, the diversity within a group, and I know the word diversity it has lots of different definitions, and here the only way we're talking about diversity is unique attributes within the membership of a group. So a lot of groups tend to be very similar to one another, so similar in age, similar in beliefs, opinions, values. So in a lot of groups that you've belonged to, you probably had so much in common with the people you were with. Like when I was a sprinter in high school, being with the other sprinters meant we all liked running really fast for a very short period of time. And we all hated running distance. We had a lot of other things in common too. And that, has some advantages. At the same time though, groups that attract people who are already very similar tend to be low in diversity of opinions, diversity of skills, and diversity of experiences. And in fact, the groups that we belong to tend to encourage increasing levels of similarity over time. So it's even been found, like when people join clubs or groups, they tend to start dressing more similarly to each other than they did at the outset. So it's almost like once you become a member of the group, you start to shave away any of your uniquenesses so that you are an even better representation of the group members. So again, what are you missing out on when that happens is uniquenesses, special talents, skills, opinions, and differences in values. So sometimes diversity can be useful. Sometimes it can challenge your sense of group cohesion and can become problematic. So sometimes when you have an already existing group of people and they get along really well, they're very similar to one another, and then someone comes in who is just a little different from the rest of the group, that can challenge the prevailing kind of attitudes and perception of cohesiveness of that group, so that diversity can be perceived as a threat. If that person is just a little bit different without really kind of putting in the effort to reduce the kind of obviousness of their diversity. At the same time, though, having people in your group, especially if you're a group that has to solve problems, achieve goals, get tasks done, and some of those activities require communication and creativity, having diverse backgrounds and points of view can be really, really helpful. It can increase levels of creativity. It can increase the use of diverse forms of communication, and it can make people more flexible in their problem solving. So, on the plus side, group cohesion feels great. Groups tend to stay together when they're really cohesive. And if you have a task that's well learned and understood, and the group is equivalent in their ability to perform the task, things are fine. If, however, your group is expected to be nimble, facing rapidly changing circumstances, that's when having people with diverse backgrounds can be really helpful. And that concludes my coverage of Learning Objective 9.2.